Hi everyone, welcome and thank you very much for joining. So my name is Rollo Burgess. I lead our capital markets post-trade team at Capco here in London. It's great to see so many of you have registered. I know lots of you, but there's lots of people who've registered who I don't know as well. So particularly welcome to you. So I think about 2 years ago, almost exactly, I was, amongst other things, supporting some US clients with US T+1, and it was around that time I first spoke to Charlie Geffen about getting involved in the initial iteration of the Accelerated Settlement Taskforce here in the UK. So given that that's a couple of years ago, it's very exciting that it feels like we're now kind of here on the grid and raring to go, leading into 2025. So my colleagues and I have been having lots of conversations around the market around this, and a key theme that comes up again and again is kind of from a practical perspective, what people should be doing in 2025. What can I be doing to get my program going and position myself for success? What's everyone else doing is always on people's minds as well. So that's what we're focused on today. We've invited a broad range of clients. My principal focus is on serving large sell-side institutions, but we've got a number of other clients from the buy side and from other stakeholders in the market. So welcome to all of you. Couple of logistical points. If you're not on the panel, you are muted, but there is a Q&A function. So do chat, put questions in the chat, please. And we will look to come to questions towards the end of the call. There will be a little poll that we'll do to give you a bit of homework to do. So that will pop up during the call and we'll look at the results of that as we progress. I'm very pleased that I've got exactly the panelists I wanted when I first thought about this topic and about getting this topic moving. So we're joined by Alex Chow, who's Investment Operations Policy Lead at the Investment Association. Alex has been involved in this discussion and thought process across the industry from the start. The Investment Association represents, I think, around 250 members, collectively managing over 9 trillion sterling of assets. So, a very important voice in the market through this transition. Andrew Douglas will be familiar to many of you, is the chair of the technical group of the Accelerated Settlement Taskforce and has also been involved in this process right from the start. And leading the group across the industry as the recommendations have been developed, which are now out for consultation and being finalised as we speak. I'm also joined by my colleague Dave Grace from our post-trade team at Capco here in London, who works with our large bank clients on market transitions like this one, and is actively involved in talking to our clients and others across the market around T+1. And bright and early by Stefan Ritz from Capco in the US. Stefan's been working with many of our clients through the US T+1 transition, so in a great position to offer sort of insight and depth on that. So look forward to a really interesting discussion. This call is really about looking forwards, not backwards. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this. So I did want to bring out a few things. As I said, it's about 2 years since we got going in the UK. The European process got moving in 2023. And after the acceptance of the recommendations by the Treasury here, the focus has really pivoted very much to sort of when and how, rather than whether this is a good idea. And frankly, if anyone, even if people from first principles didn't think this was a good idea, I think the US having moved, it's very clear that this has to happen. The technical group of the UK Taskforce under Andrew's chairmanship has been focused on developing specific recommendations with broad engagement from lots and lots of stakeholders across the industry, which has been great to see. So taking lots of viewpoints into account and considering lessons from the transition in the US that happened earlier this year. The good news, I think very good news for the market, is that it does, and Andrew, you can probably be more specific on exactly where we're at, but it does feel like we're coalescing across Europe around a date in October 27, which is great. And that should position the market to move forward in a kind of consistent and coherent way. So that's the journey so far. So before I get going, a bottle of acceptable entry-level champagne, courtesy of Rollo, not Capco, for the first non-Capco employee who sends me telling me that they've spotted where the reference in the title of this slide comes from. It's a fantasy literature book that I like. Capco people not allowed to play. Right. So our hypotheses around both what we're talking to people about in the market and what we think from first principles people need to be doing. And we'll sort of refer back to this as we progress. But firstly, fairly obviously, many people have done this already, but if you haven't, you need to be mobilizing your program. You need to have budgets, you need to have resources, you need to have a view on your delivery team, the resourcing model, and what you need to have to move forward successfully with your program. Critically, for me, I think that the data environment, metrics, tooling, accelerators is going to be absolutely at the heart of a successful implementation of T+1. A lot of this is about understanding bottlenecks, root causes, and the factors that drive your settlement performance at the moment, and zeroing in on what to do and where to place your investments to improve those. And getting the data right up front is absolutely key to that. Platform engineering. So for many institutions, the critical path from a sort of build perspective will be about understanding their front to back systems flow and figuring out where their sort of batch architecture and other things that potentially take longer to change and have more complicated release profiles need to get addressed. So if you haven't done this already, doing the analysis to understand where the points that you're going to need to intervene are there, and planning that work is very important. Client engagement and automation is obviously central. A lot of the things that drive slower settlement performance relate to client behaviors and sort of behaviors across the market. Understanding those, working with your clients to educate and inform, to understand the drivers of delays in the settlement process, and give people the right tools and the right information to address those is going to be central, both to achieving what you need to achieve and to making that a positive experience for clients. And finally, as we say here, think big. I don't think people should assume necessarily that their existing booking models, network models, etc. across Europe are where they should be in a few years' time in order to optimize. So people should be looking at their booking models, looking at their networks, and thinking about whether there are opportunities to use this journey to simplify and streamline your model in order to get where you need to be. And I'm not going to look sort of right out, but I would draw attention to the fact that if we look at the US, there was a significant testing window towards the end of the program of implementation in the US for many people, and within geographic Europe, it's a lot more complicated in terms of the number of permutations of ways a settlement can go. So I think people need to plan that into there. We will shortly kick off a little poll where you can say of those activities what you are planning to do in 2025. So you can tick all that apply. I'm interested to see if anyone does tick nothing, we're cool. So please do fill that out, and we'll get going with the panel discussion now. You've heard enough from me, but we'll come back to this later in the call and see what people have said. Excellent. Good. So as I say, you've heard enough from me. So moving on to the discussion, I'm going to come first to you, Andrew. Firstly, look, congratulations on getting to a set of recommendations, which from all the discussions I've had seems to have been really well received. There's obviously a bit of grumbling from some of the usual suspects, but I think at the lower end of what one could have expected. So I think that's great. A lot of the conversations I've had, people have focused on the post-trade code of conduct that's discussed in the recommendations. So I was going to ask you to talk about where we're at now and what comes next, and maybe focus on that code of conduct and how you see the thinking around that progressing.
Sure. Thanks, Rollo, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this event. One of the reasons that I enjoy speaking at these events is one of our work streams was called Lessons Learned from Other Jurisdictions, principally from North America. And one of the key messages that we learned was that the three most important things about this project are communication, communication, and communication. So this opportunity to talk to a bunch of folks that I may not have had the opportunity to talk to before is very much appreciated. So where are we? in the overall scheme of things. As you noted at the start, Rollo, we are in the process of converting the draft recommendations plus the responses to the consultation into the final draft of the report, which we are calling the T+1 Code of Conduct. And as you said, a lot of the feedback that came to the consultation was, well, what is this code of conduct? What are you talking about? Basically, I got three fundamental questions. One, what is it? Two, will I have to sign anything? And three, do the regulators support it? So it's probably easiest if I address each of those in turn. So firstly, what is it? Think of it as a handbook for post-trade operation in the UK, which if you follow it, you will successfully be able to transact on a T+1 basis. It comprises two sections. One is a section that we've called principles, which are how you should approach, how we feel you should approach this project. And the second section is the actual rules. These are the things that you would need to do. So let me focus on the principles to start with. And there are two that I would like to highlight for the people attending today. The first one is automation. There is anecdotal evidence coming out of the States that those firms that didn't automate, and I'll give you two scary statistics from surveys that have been done in the US. The first one is 3 months before US go live, 30% of the participants had done nothing, zero, to prepare for the implementation of T+1. The second scary statistic is that of those people who had decided to automate, 75% of their projects had a deadline that was after US go live. Not really very helpful. So automation is critical. You need the second principle is you need to start that process now. It sounds, if you say it quickly, 2 3/4 years from now to go live. Sounds like it's ages away. Trust me, it won't be ages away. We will be in 2027 before we know where we are, and nobody wants to be in that 30% of participants have done nothing when it gets to the middle of 2027. So what I am encouraging people to do, the two main principles are, as I said, automate stuff. Again, another statistic, firms in the US who didn't automate are now facing an average of around 16 to 18% increase in staffing costs, and that's not sustainable in the long term. So you need to automate to be able to do this. And secondly, you don't need to wait until 2025, 2026 or 2027 to do this. You could start today. I was talking to the guys at Crest recently, and 5% of transactions in the UK today settle on T+1. So there are people out there who are already doing this, and I would encourage firms to think about, what do I need to do to be one of that cohort of folks for whom October 27 will be a non-event because you will already have adopted T+1. So that's the first part. What is the code of conduct? Secondly, will I have to sign anything? At the moment, the analogy is the money market code and the global FX code, both of which require you to sign something that says this is basically what they call a statement of commitment. So it says, I will be following what is in the code. We have not made a decision on that at the moment. I don't think we're in favour, well, I know we're not in favour of having a mandatory signature on this document, but maybe there is a voluntary solution there, or maybe there is nothing at all. And I'd be interested if people want to put things in the chat. I'd be interested to know what people's views are on having folks sign up to the code of conduct. So the first bit, what is the code of conduct? 2, do I have to sign anything? 3, does it have regulatory support? We have spent a lot of time speaking to HMT, speaking to the FCA, and speaking to the Bank of England to understand their commitment to the success of this project, for which commitment to the code of conduct will be critical. And I think it would be fair to say that all 3 of the authorities in the UK are firmly behind this. HMT clearly will have to lay a statutory instrument before Parliament, because CSDR will need to be changed to reflect the move to T+1. The FCA, we're engaged in conversations with them and the Bank of England at the moment to understand what is in their toolkit that will enable them to offer visible support. So all of that will be clear in the document that we publish in January of next year. It'll be completed before Christmas, but there is a process whereby it has to go through government approval. So it will actually get published in January of next year. So all will be revealed at that point. So hopefully that addresses where we are with the code of conduct and what the code of conduct is. And just a few words, I guess, about what the process is from here on in. So as I said, we will finish our work in the task force. And just to give you an idea of how inclusive the work of the task force has been, I have a spreadsheet with 450 names on it. These are all people who have volunteered from within the UK industry. I think they represent 116 different firms. They have all been involved in the process of creating the original recommendations and then transforming them into these rules for us all to follow. So these aren't my rules. Alex is on the task force. Alex and I didn't sit in the Seahorse pub near Crest. Well, we did recently, but not to create the rules. These rules have been drafted over a period of 9 months, 10 months by the input of 450 folks. So these represent very much the opinion of the market as to what the market is looking for from its peers to get this project successfully implemented in 27. So we will be publishing, we'll be finalising the report before Christmas. It will be published in January, and date for your diaries, on the 20th of February, we will be hosting an industry event to which, on a first come first served basis, folks will be able to attend and listen to, not me, because I'm not important in this process. It's going to be people like Alex who've done the work, and they will explain the conclusions that we've reached, and we'll answer any questions. And at that point, what will happen is we will move into implementation over the 2.5, 2 3/4 years. The task force will persist for that period of time. As many of you may know, Euroclear have generously agreed to sponsor the existence of the task force. So we will move from being the entity that plans T+1 in the UK to being the entity which manages the implementation, the successful implementation of T+1. You mentioned a little earlier, Rollo, about Europe, and so it would be remiss of me not to mention Europe. Europe, in the form of ESMA, issued their statement of intent towards T+1. And pleasingly, from our perspective, they selected the same date as the UK has picked, which is the 11th of October 2027. So we have achieved, I consider that we have a tick in the first box of the things that we intended to achieve with this project. It was very clear from the get-go that everyone in the market, their priority was that we would have one migration, one operational migration to cover the UK and the EU. And that is what we have, in principle, achieved at this point. So I'm looking forward to working with the European authorities and the chair of the European group when that is announced, hopefully in the next few days, on the creation of a single plan to take us both through to the successful implementation of T+1 in 2027. And my goal is to bring all of the guys and ladies who have dialed in today expressing an interest in T+1 to bring you along with us so that we can all cross the finish line together.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's super helpful. I'm gonna come now to Alex. Alex, as I said, you've been in this from the start, and I thought the paper that the Investment Association put out in October was excellent. And if people haven't read that, they should do. Can I ask you to summarise kind of where you're at in your thinking with regards to the current recommendations and what your focus areas with your members are?
Yeah, happy to, Rollo, and thanks for the invite to be here. Very, very happy to be here. And I think the slide title came from a Brandon Sanderson book, but yeah, you can confirm to me later on. So yeah, absolutely. We've been very much engaged in the T+1 project from the start. So first of all, we were looking more at the US transition, rightly or wrongly, as very much a heavier weighting there than the UK and Europe. So our latest stats suggest 35% in North America, 20% in the UK, 19% in Europe. Then when you start looking at some of the global ETF tracking global equity products, that's more like 65, 70% US weighting. So the biggest market for our members. So once it got announced on February 2023 for the May 2024 go live, we got into full gear with our members, formed 5 or 6 different working groups around trade settlement, funding, FX, stock lending, collateral, ETFs. And I'm happy to say that with the go live in May 2024, it largely went quite well. So when we surveyed members afterwards, we had 40 to 50 come back. No one expressed any major showstoppers, and only around 20% suggested there were any sort of minor issues which they were able to get over. So very much a transition that went well, and that's a testament to the sort of preparedness of the buy side. What it did leave us with were a few issues which we knew were going to be issues ahead of time and have remained issues. So that's things like, in particular, the funding gap. So that's where for UK funds, cash comes in on T+3, T+4, when for example, me and you on the market invest into these funds versus having to sort of purchase shares on the same day, and that's settling T+1. So having that 2 to 3 day funding gap, there was already a funding gap, but it's been exacerbated, and that's just extra costs. So in mutual funds, maybe it can be managed. For big subscriptions, there may be some sort of small swing price adjustment to the investor coming in. And for ETFs, we're seeing a slight increase on the midpoint versus the fair market value of the underlying securities. So everything's very slightly more expensive, but when you're talking about the volumes our members see from investors, it's quite a big amount. So then attention moved to advocacy for the UK and EU T+1, given that, and it had been difficult to get consensus. So given those costs, there was quite a lot of appetite from traders and PMs to transition the UK and EU to T+1 as soon as possible. But also at the same time, they wanted the UK and Europe to transition at the same time. So they're not strictly opposed, but at some points it did seem like they were. So in the same sort of survey and engagement with members, the midpoint we ended up at is a preference for an October 2026, I think it was autumn 2026 transition date. So that was a midpoint of where our members' views were. Some wanted to go earlier, some wanted to go later. But we were very much, I guess, a knowledge that we'd have to concede to 2027, both in terms of the political process in the UK and EU, and just because some of the other entities in the market may not be ready. Generally, we're happy with where the UK and EU has ended up with recommending the 11th of October, or on the cusp of recommending that date. And we're very much looking for them to set it in stone to avoid any slippage further back to 2028 or beyond. We do have a few open questions around code of conduct, which Andrew is addressing as we speak. Things like what will happen with trade matching, stock lending, and for the buy side in particular, the fund settlement cycle, because with capital markets moving to T+1 is a fund settlement cycle of T+4 really viable, probably less so. And so I'll leave it at that, and happy to go into more of those topics later. But yeah, that's roughly where we're at. Yeah.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. That's super helpful. So, Stefan, I think at this point it'd be quite interesting, as we're obviously at an early, an early stage, but when things have started to take shape in terms of the UK and Europe, to get your view on how the sort of debate and the level of preparedness and thinking compares now over here to where the US was at a similar point in its transition. Would you be able to comment a bit on that?
Sure. So, I mean, look, as it was mentioned by both Andrew and Alex, everybody was kind of observing the transition to T+1 from a US perspective, right? The methodology was very similar, or is very similar from what I'm hearing. We did have SIFMA working with the industry to basically plan for that transition. They established a runbook, if you will, helping the participants to understand the rules, where they should focus on from, a transformation perspective, processes, technology, et cetera, et cetera. I will caveat one component, though, that's very different between the US and Europe, UK, and Switzerland. We do have only one exchange, the TCC. You guys are dealing with a lot more than one. So that kind of adds a layer of complexity, hence the timeline being potentially what it is. But it is critical for participants, either on the buy side or the sell side, to have a very strong program established, right? To make sure that you do have a full dedicated program team, because everybody's got a day job, right? But this is a big undertaking. So this is not, a side job, so to speak, right? There's a lot of assessments to be done from a people, process, technology aspect, right? The cycles are much shorter, so the settlement doesn't change, but you need to do it a lot faster. So that straight-through processing or automation is critical, right? The right level of controls, the right level of coverage, because if you don't have all those elements in place and right, to Alex's point, there will be some cost implication. And the cost of doing business becomes slightly more challenging if you're not meeting all those deadlines. Mm. One piece that we observed in the US at least was quite interesting, especially on the buy side, where people were not as concerned, if you will, of the transition to T+1 because of the vendor reliance, right? So when we were talking to our clients, the main comment was, well, that's not my problem, right? This is a vendor problem. I'll talk to my rep at Pershing or Broadridge. They need to be ready, not me or any other broker dealer for that matter, right? So we had to do a lot of communication there, especially as it relates to making them understand, look, I mean, yes, you rely on a vendor, but at the end of the day, that's your client. So if you're not able to accommodate the new settlement cycle, the client's going to go to the next one, right? So it is critical to have that communication. And it is something that's not necessarily aligned with all the programs. It is communication internally, so making sure that everybody understands what the new implications are as far as the new settlement, but also externally. So that's your client communication type, right? So all those elements are critical. The testing piece, even though, as I said, I mean, it's a little bit more simple, quote unquote, is very critical. So we had to deal with 3 different types of testing. One was internally, making sure that any technology transformation was operating as expected. The connectivity and testing with your vendors, right? Making sure that you had the right open communication channels, and then the industry testing, which in the grand scheme of things lasted 42 weeks. So 3 cycles of 7 sub-cycles with 2 weeks per cycle. So if my math is right, we're looking at basically 42 weeks, give or take, of testing. So it is something that is to be considered. Your testing program needs to be established, have the right testing environments, have the right communication with your counterparties to make sure that, you know, it does happen very smoothly. And this is one of the key reasons why the transition to T+1 in the US, as far as I'm concerned, and across the industry, has been very successful. I mean, we were expecting a lot more challenges, and the connectivity among the industry was actually really, really important. We had working groups, et cetera, et cetera. So this is nothing new. I think, you know, you guys are on the other side of the pond are really considering the same type of methodology and approaches, at least from what I just heard. So I mean, you know, that's kind of the lessons learned at a very high level from the US.
Great, cool. No, thank you very much, Stefan. That's interesting to hear. Thank you, and good to get that perspective. Can I, guys, is it possible for us now to see the output of the poll? People have had a little bit of time to. Okay. Wow, so that's 0% are done. Okay, that's a healthy note of realism amongst this audience, so that's good to see. Good and good to see. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So actually, most of those themes that we were thinking about being addressed, and perhaps the market simplification is something people think about more. Dave, if I come to you now, I know you're very active in sort of a number of clients looking at this. Do you want to have a look at that and talk about how that tracks with your experience on the ground and the conversations you're having?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rollo. Yeah, I mean, what I would say, looking at the results, I think it would probably reflect largely where I'd expect it to come out. Clearly, a large percentage of the market are looking at mobilising their programme next year. That's probably not unsurprising to most. I guess my worry is that 68% is relatively low. I'd expect that to be in the high 80s or 90s, unless there's a group of participants out there that think T+1 is an easy change. I guess to sort of lay out, just to layer on what the guys have been saying so far, a change from T+3 to T+2 was relatively benign and arguably could just be considered more of a static data change with some market adjustment to kind of sweep up some fails on over the transition period and adjust some sort of downstream processing to cater for the new timeline. In reality, a move from T+2 to T+1 is fundamentally different, and it's different because processes that have been comfortably run on T+1 cannot be run on T+1. They need to be run on T+0. That introduces platform engineering challenges, data and environment. It looks booking models, fundamental structure of how you're clearing and settling trades, agent bank models. It brings all of these things into real focus. So although I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be plans in place for 2025 to address those, I think what we'd be advocating is looking at those opportunities, looking at the threats in those areas specifically. For me, a program mobilization should be definitely focused on the T0 environment. I think most participants out there will be clearly familiar with the client angle to this in terms of confirmations and allocations with the buy side. I think that problem has been very well understood. My sense from speaking to clients is, from the sell side perspective, they have very little issues with that requirement T0 from a confirmation and allocation perspective. They think they're highly automated with majority of their clients. So I think this is generally not a big problem. It's clearly the low automation end, the sort of 10% of their flow which generates 80% of the work. Those challenges are clearly need addressing. CSDR didn't necessarily provide the environment to need to address them, but now I think there's an opportunity there that does need to be looked at. It goes without saying, if you settle less trades in the market, you are much more likely to be successful in T+1. So I would advocate looking at a booking model simplification program. Additional to that, the implications of the T0 environment need to consider, and I think Alex will talk about the stock lending return process specifically, but equally cash management and liquidity management. Those forecasting is likely to be done T+1. You will obviously need a very accurate state of inventory and cash on T0 to be able to make that successful. And not just the technology requirements or the technology batch driven processes that may run overnight need to be looked at. It's fundamentally the inputs to those processes. So anything you can do to simplify those, I would suggest should become higher up on the priority. But again, I'd see that necessarily as part of the program mobilization. The one thing I think is actually relatively low, and I think my personal experience when I was at Barclays previously, and some of the other large broker dealers I worked at CSDR when I was at Capco, client engagement, the firms that are most successful are the ones that are engaging clients both internally and externally. And what I mean by that is there's no point going to the business in 2026 asking them for loads of money to fix some significant problems, because they're not going to understand the problem. I would advocate engaging with the heads of trading now, your client service management teams, the ones that are talking directly at a relationship level to clients. Those are the kind of conversations that should be happening. They're the ones that you can get to sponsor and advocate on your behalf from a budget perspective. To try and submit something into a budget typically is middle of the year next year if you want something for 26. Then you have to go through a round of trying to secure buy-in for that funding. Now is the time to be doing that, in my opinion. So cool. I'm sure there's lots more we could talk through, but yeah, I think generally the poll would reflect probably where everyone else is in the market that I'm speaking to.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Dave. I think that's good. I'm quite encouraged by the results of the poll, actually. So, I mean, Andrew, I know you're spending a lot of time talking to people across the market. I mean, does what Dave said and what people have said in the poll broadly track with what you're seeing? Are there any?
I find it very encouraging, the numbers, given that we haven't fired the starting pistol yet. Technically, that hadn't been published in January, and the government comes out with its supportive statement, which hopefully it will, probably sometime in February. So I'm pleased to hear that even at this period of time, relatively advanced period of time, 66% of the people who dialed in are focused on program mobilization. I would say that is the biggest thing I get asked about, and it's often the underlying reason as to why people ask about the code of conduct. We are, and I've worked in the post-trade environment for 35 years, so I've lived this, and we are notoriously poor at investing in the back office. We have been historically. I like to joke that Big Bang for the front office was in 1987. It's only taken the back office 40 years to catch up by having Big Bang in the back office. So the thing I get asked mostly is, I need, or the point that is made to me is, I need a bit of paper that I can wave in front of my investment committee that says, you need to fund this project. The code of conduct will be that document. It will have regulatory support. You will be able to go to your investment committees in 2025 and say, I have to do these things, and in order to do them, I need cash. It's not a regulation, but it's about as close to a regulatory requirement as you get without being a regulatory requirement. And I hope people won't squander the opportunity to secure that investment for something that you absolutely will have to do over the next 3 years, because if you don't, you won't have a year 4. It's as simple as that. So again, I go back to what I said before, the two commitments that I'm looking for from the industry: a commitment to automate, a commitment to start these processes now, to start this project now. So fundamentally, 2025 is understanding, once you've read all the requirements, understanding what you have to do in order to comply with them, securing the investment for that, and then in 2026, carrying out those projects, so that by the end of 26, you're ready to enter, as Stefan talked about. There will be an extensive testing period. You need to be ready to be able to do that. And as I said, I'll say it again, people who've heard me talk on this subject before will have heard me say this before. Don't be one of the 30% in the middle of 27 who's done nothing.
Great. No, thank you.
I'm very encouraged by those numbers that people are taking this seriously.
Cool. Great. No, that's really positive from my perspective as well. Just checking. I mean, Stefan, Andrew referred to some of the sort of statistics around costs and headcount that some participants are seeing in the US. I mean, presumably that's kind of what happens if you don't focus on this early enough, is you end up having to throw people at it. Sort of, have you sort of briefly, because we need to keep moving, but have you seen that, and are there points you'd make in connection to that, because those are quite alarming stats?
So, I mean, very briefly, but I want to pick on one piece that Andrew just mentioned. So basically T+1 to us, right, at least here in the US, is an opportunity to basically lift the hood in your operation processes and actually push your agenda as far as optimization and streamlining. To the stat before, some firms still have 15, 20, 30% of their book of work not done. And, I don't want to say they missed the boat, but, it's going to be very challenging for them to catch up. From a cost perspective, so there's few dimensions here. So if you're not able to meet the new timelines, right, the cutoff times for your allocation, confirmation, and affirmation, there's an expensive cost of business to be added, right? From a DTCC perspective, they do have their night delivery orders, their day delivery orders, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm not going to go into the specifics, but there's basically a fee associated to that. Now, from an operation perspective, to your point, Rollo, if you're not able to have your automation in place, you need to start throwing people at the process. There's a concept of follow the moon as opposed to follow the sun with the end-offs, right? So especially when you're dealing with APAC or EMEA, again, from a benchmark of the US, you need to make sure that, your investigations are done, your correction of trades are done on time, right? And obviously timelines are shrunk. So there's a cost to that. The last component of that is obviously if you're not able to accommodate your T+1, you lose clients and revenue, right? And the funding of trades, especially as it relates to FX, is a true challenge. You do have your liquidity management, your capital requirement management, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a little bit of business strategy to be done here as far as do you pre-fund the trade, right? But that kind of diffuses the purpose of T+1, right? I mean, basically you're mobilizing liquidity, which is not optimal. Or, you really work on that funding strategy. So there are costs associated throughout the entire life cycle, if you will, depending on where you are on the sell side or the buy side.
Great. No, thank you. And that's some really good points for people to think about. I mean, Alex, as you've heard the views of the panel on the process, and I think broad encouragement on the sort of where the industry's at. Are there kind of benefits over and above complying with obligations? Are there benefits that you think your members are looking for from these changes and from their service providers through this process?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to talk about, because in terms of the move from T+2 to T+1 itself, do we agree with all the SEC espoused benefits? Probably they don't impact the buy side so much, like the margin savings, etc. I think where our members see the benefit for the UK and EU transition is sort of more alignment across markets globally. So I think we discussed some of the costs earlier. So looking at ETFs in particular, they trade T+2 when you buy it on the exchange, for example. All the underlying trades used to trade T+2, and the primary settlement cycle between authorized participants and issuers was T+2. That's relatively frictionless. Now, because one of those is at T+1, the settlement of the underlying, we're seeing the mid-market price is 2 basis points higher than it would have been Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Friday, and 5 basis points on Thursday, just because it's accounting for that funding over the weekend. So yeah, just looking to, I guess, bring those costs down, and those are costs that are borne by the investor if they buy it directly, or maybe indirectly through pension funds and the like. I think the other big benefit, which Stefan touched on briefly, was opening the bonnet or the hood, depending if you're UK, US, and looking at post-trade and finally getting some investment, buy side or sell side, to revolutionize your processes and what you do. And that's not just operations looking at it, it's how it's fed down through the whole value chain from the traders when they're doing their actions, when you get your broker confirms from the sell side, trying to engage them to be better, and looking at allocations, confirmations, etc. I guess in terms of what we're looking at, if we reflect on lessons learned from the US transition, one of the things that's frequently cited, which irks me, but it's kind of true at the same time, is a lot of the sell-side banks will say the buy-side aren't too engaged. And that is probably true. We have a long tail of firms. So the very biggest, and of course, you've got your small boutique family offices who are also coming to us quite close to May 2024. I guess just flipping that on its head somewhat, we also had a good amount of firms who were very engaged early on, before February 2023, and certainly immediately after. And they had a number of questions for some of their sell-side counterparts, things like what your allocation confirmation affirmation deadline is going to be, because the buy side don't work to the 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the US. How are you going to help with FX? Are your models going to change? Are your cutoffs going to change? So things like that. And some of it was waiting for the SEC to confirm. But on the other side, I think there's a mixed sort of responsiveness from the sell side. So early communication, early setting of whatever changes you're going to make from the UK EU move is very good for sort of client engagement and helping them develop their own programs.
Cool. No, thank you. That's helpful. We've got some questions actually that have come in that I'll come to in a minute. But before I do, very briefly, I mean, Dave, Stefan, obviously, you know, we're all focused on T+1 on this call, but clearly people have other things they're focused on too. Any top other competing priorities that are hitting the same teams that you guys see out there when you're talking to clients, and just any considerations on that? Please do be quick, because I'd like to get to questions.
Well, I guess you know, we're going to see EMIR 3. We're going to see quite a few other regulations hitting in those sort of regulatory change kind of spaces. But in terms of clearing and settlement, I think there's as an operating process, there's probably nothing significant that would prevent them from doing that. I think where the change budgets have been allocated towards reg programs, I think there was a hope that they could work on discretionary projects now and start building business and adding value to the business overall in terms of the general direction of change spend. Obviously, this just pivots the banks or institutions back to mandatory change, which personally I would see this as an opportunity to actually, if you were very ambitious in this space, you could actually return capital to the balance sheets, you could reduce costs, you could grow the top line, particularly for a security services provider. There's opportunities here that you could actually grasp if you were willing to invest some time and effort into it. So it's not all doom and gloom, but yeah, I would say that there's it's balancing the mandatory with the discretionary.
100%, and I think just to Andrew's point earlier, this should be a great catalyst for investment and modernisation in front of our processes for people if people seize the opportunity. Stefan, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything Dave and yourself just said. The add-on that I would put is really the opportunity to look at your ops resiliency programs, your control framework, et cetera, because with the accelerated cycles, obviously, you need to pressure test those, right? I mean, the back to operations, so to speak, needs to be thought through and accelerated. So those are the two main points that I would suggest firms look at. It's not after the fact, that could be concurrent.
Great. Good. Thank you. Cool. I think we've got time for some audience questions. So we've got a few. Right. So let me see. Andrew, I can't remember the chapter and verse of which recommendation it is, but there is a point around sending instructions electronically. Can we is it possible to elaborate a bit on? I mean, does that cheekily is an email electronic? Is the question that I've been asked.
An interesting question in terms of what constitutes electronic. For me, it's automatable. So if it's automatable, then it's electronic. That to me doesn't necessarily cover simply sending an email. That is not the solution to this. And one of the points that I would make, which kind of picks up on some of the comments that we've just heard from Stefan and Dave, and it's certainly a comment that has been made to me more than once by folks in the industry, and that is previous initiatives we've been able to get away with doing the bare minimum. We've put an extra sticking plaster over something, or we've added an extra elastic band. This isn't going to work for this. Someone who's far more intelligent than I calculated that if you start looking at the actual number of working hours that are available to process the trades, whilst T+1 sounds like half of T+2, it's actually an 83% reduction in the number of working hours. So I repeat what I said earlier, you won't be able to do this without either throwing lots of folks at it, which is not sustainable in the long term, or you get to use Stefan's parlance, you have to get under the hood and you have to re-engineer your back office for this. Because don't forget, and this is another question I get asked, what's happening with T0? Why aren't you talking about T0? Well, we're not talking about it because you've got to learn to walk before you can run. So we need to get, again, someone else in the task force talks about getting your office match fit, getting your back office match fit. And at the moment, we aren't match fit for T1, let alone T0. Moving to T1 and using that as the catalyst for the automation that is necessary to move to T1 will put you in good stead for the, I'm afraid, eventual move to T0. Because when we first started this process, people would send me random posts on LinkedIn or emails, and I got one from someone who's involved in a digital CSD. And he said, I'm just shocked by this. You're taking 2 days to settle a trade. We do it instantaneously. Like, what century are you living in? And so there is work that we need to do from a market perspective. I still have seen no adequate solution to the elimination of netting, for example, that a move to T0 would bring about. As someone from CLS, when I was talking to them about their process, they do something like 98% netting on their thing, because quite simply, if they operated at a gross level, there isn't enough money in the entire world to be able to satisfy the transactions. And it's a similar argument for us in the securities world. It would be impossible for us to operate at a gross level. So how are we going to accommodate netting? There's probably an answer. I don't know what it is. But think of this move to T+1 as a step on the journey to the ultimate destination, which has to be instantaneous settlement. How many, I mean, here in the UK, we have, now you can get your cash instantaneously through faster payments. So people just aren't ready, aren't prepared to wait anymore. And people start asking the question, what are you doing with my money for 2 days? What are you doing with my money for 1 day? And the ability to react instantaneously to market change, or market shocks, as it usually is, has a great value. And that's what the move to T+1 will give you, that quicker response time. And ultimately, the move to T0 is the absolute epitome of being able to respond to market shocks. but we won't get there without going through this stage, and this stage requires some painful work, and there's no avoiding that, I'm afraid.
Cool, good. Thank you very much. We don't have very long, but I've got another question, and there's not very long to address it, but it is a good one around stock borrow lending, which is obviously one of the kind of lightning rods for a challenge around this project, and where I think actually there were some issues and sort of increases in recalls and so forth seen in the US. Alex, I know you've done a lot of work on this. I know it's very much a live topic, but have you got any brief remarks and thoughts you can share on where we're at from a stock borrow lend perspective before we close?
No, of course. And I'd just say on T0, we have to keep an eye on it, because if the US start doing it by 2027, 2028, we can't just say it's too complicated. It's something we're keeping a watching brief on, but hoping doesn't happen too soon. But yeah, for sec lending, so it has been challenging for the US and for the UK and Europe. I still don't think we've found the right solution, although I think ISLA are getting there. So there's three competing groups. You've got the borrowers, tend to be your brokers, but obviously not exclusively, your lenders, who tend to be the either specialist agent lenders or custodian banks, and then the asset owners, who are the asset managers and their clients. And across them, they have sort of competing priorities as it comes to sec lending. So the borrowers want the notifications as early as possible so they can substitute, borrow something else. And then the lenders and the asset owners want to give it as late as possible, because they want to be able to trade in the market and then send it after the market closes. Where ISLA have landed up, agreeing between borrowers and lenders, is two different deadlines. So one is half an hour before market close for the UK. So I think off the top of my head, that's 3:15. And then a deadline to return the stock on T+1, 30 minutes before DVP ends. So I think that's 4 o'clock, or is it the other way around? I think it's the other way around. So yeah, obviously it is kudos to them to get the borrowers and lenders to agree, but from our member firms, it's kind of a best efforts on a best efforts basis, because there's a lot of end of day trading, and if you trade end of day, you're going to miss the cutoff, which is 30 minutes before end of day trading. So more work to be done there, and it remains one of the open questions, I think. But luckily, we don't have cash penalties. It's harder for Europe still. So TBC in that space.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. And we're right up on time, so I think I'm going to move. I'm going to move now to close. Firstly, thank you very, very much to the panel, particularly to Alex and Andrew for joining, and for everyone who dialed in and stayed with us through the call. I think it's been a definitely useful discussion for me, and I hope for you too. If you do have follow-up questions or comments or thoughts, please do reach out to me or any of the team. Our contact details are there. I will send a note round in a few days. There will be we have made a recording of this call, and there will be a link to that I'll send round. We've also got a little cheeky little demo of some data tooling that we've been working on from a Capco perspective, in terms of looking at how people can enhance their processes and dig into assessment fails and predictive analytics around that, which we'll share with that too. And any other links to other T+1 related goodies that should be of interest to people. So I'll send that out. We will be doing more events like this in the new year. We might even try and do one in person if that works. And I know that there's a lot of other topics. Treasury clearing is a big one that Stefan and his team are working on in the US. That's probably impacting a lot of you guys too. But do let me know if there are any particular themes that you'd like to get into, either T+1 related or on other matters. So look, thank you very much indeed. We're Wednesday afternoon for those of us in Europe, so over the hump of the week now. Thank you very much. It's been a super useful discussion from me. Very grateful to you all for joining, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.